In the summer of 1941, Wehrmacht soldiers on the Eastern Front began reporting something impossible. They described aircraft approaching in complete darkness, engines cutting out, then bombs falling from nowhere followed by the sound of a broomstick sweeping through the night sky. German pilots scrambled to intercept these phantom attackers but found nothing. Or worse, found ancient biplanes made of wood and fabric that flew so slowly their modern fighters stalled trying to engage them. By 1943, these night witches had become the most feared sound on the Eastern Front, and German commanders were offering Iron Crosses to any pilot who could shoot one down. This was the 588th Night Bomber Regiment of the Soviet Air Force. Every pilot, navigator, mechanic, and commander was female. They flew antiquated Polikarpov PUR-2 biplanes, training aircraft that shouldn't have survived a single combat mission. Over 3 years, they would fly more than 30,000 sorties, drop more than 23,000 tons of bombs, and never once did a night which surrender to the enemy. The story begins not with war, but with discrimination. In the 1930s, the Soviet Union officially promoted gender equality, but the military remained stubbornly male. Women could serve as nurses, radio operators, clerks, never as combat pilots. Marina Raskova, the Soviet Union's most famous female aviator, had set multiple long-distance flight records. She was a national hero, a confidant of Stalin himself. But when war came in June 1941, even she couldn't get permission to form female combat units. The German invasion changed everything. In the first 6 months, the Luftwaffe destroyed thousands of Soviet aircraft. Pilot casualties were catastrophic. The Soviet Air Force needed replacements desperately. Raskova saw her opportunity. She went directly to Stalin with a proposal: create 3 all-female air regiments. 1 for fighters, 1 for dive bombers, 1 for night bombers. Stalin, facing military catastrophe, approved. The order came in October 1941. Form the 588th Night Bomber Aviation Regiment. Volunteers flooded in. Over 2,000 women applied for fewer than 500 positions. Most were in their late teens or early 20s. Many were university students, teachers, factory workers. Some had flying experience through aeroclub programs. Most did not. Their average age was 22. The youngest was 15. She lied about her age to enlist. Training began at Engels, a town on the Volga River. The women faced immediate problems. The Soviet Air Force had no uniforms in women's sizes. They wore men's uniforms, boots 4 sizes too large stuffed with newspapers, flight suits that dragged on the ground. One pilot recalled that her boots were so oversized she had to wrap her feet in cloth just to keep them from falling off during flight. The aircraft assignment was almost insulting. The PUR-2 was a primary trainer designed in 1927. It was a biplane with an open cockpit, maximum speed of 94 miles per hour, service ceiling of 10,000 feet. It was built from plywood and canvas stretched over a wooden frame. It had no radios, no guns except what the navigator might carry, no parachutes. They were too heavy and took up space needed for bombs. The aircraft couldn't carry more than 770 pounds of ordnance, typically 6 bombs of approximately 110 to 220 pounds each, mounted under the lower wings and fuselage. To call it unsuitable for combat was generous. German fighters flew at 300 miles per hour. A single burst from a Messerschmitt's cannon would tear a PUR-2 to pieces. The aircraft had one advantage, though nobody recognized it initially. It was too slow. German fighters couldn't engage it effectively because their stall speed was higher than the PUR-2's maximum speed. If a Bf-109 tried to slow down enough to hit a PUR-2, it would literally fall from the sky. The women trained for 6 months. They learned night navigation using only a compass, stopwatch, and map. They practiced flying in total darkness. No lights, no instruments beyond the most basic. They learned to drop bombs by eye, judging wind drift and trajectory from experience. Most importantly, they developed the tactic that would make them legends. The standard approach was this: fly at approximately 10,000 feet toward the target, 3 to 5 kilometers away, cut the engine, glide in silently toward the target. At approximately 800 meters altitude, release bombs, then restart the engine and escape in the darkness. The sound of the P-2's engine cutting out and the subsequent glide created an eerie whistling sound, like wind through a broomstick. German soldiers said it sounded like witches flying through the night. The regiment deployed to the front in May 1942. Their first base was near the Caucasus Mountains. Conditions were primitive: tents for housing, hand-dug earth revetments to protect aircraft, no ground equipment beyond what they could scavenge. The women did everything themselves: loaded bombs, repaired aircraft, filled fuel tanks by hand from barrels. Between missions, they slept under the wings of their aircraft. The first combat missions were terrifying. Lieutenant Irina Sabrova described her first sortie. "We approached the target, and I cut the engine as trained. But in the sudden silence, I could hear everything: the wind whistling through the wing wires, anti-aircraft guns firing below, my navigator breathing behind me. I realized we were completely exposed. If they saw us, we were dead. The P-2 had no protection, no speed, nothing. Just us and a plane made of wood and fabric. But the tactic worked. The Germans couldn't hear the P-2 approaching until bombs were already falling. By the time searchlights found the aircraft, it had restarted its engine and was disappearing into darkness. Anti-aircraft fire was ineffective. The P-2 was too small, too slow, too agile at low altitude. Night fighters rarely caught them. When they did, the P-2's slow speed often saved it. German pilots would dive after them, only to overshoot or stall out. The Night Witches developed extraordinary courage and skill. They flew multiple sorties per night, sometimes 8 or 10 missions in a single night. Each sortie was approximately 40 minutes. 15 minutes to target, bomb run, 15 minutes back. Land, refuel and rearm in 10 minutes, take off again. All night, every night the weather allowed. The women flew in pairs or trios. While one aircraft attacked, the others would orbit nearby, drawing searchlights and anti-aircraft fire. The moment the first aircraft dropped its bombs and escaped, a second would dive in from another direction before the Germans could reorient their defenses. The tactic was brutally effective but exhausting. Pilots would fly until they literally couldn't stay awake. Then their squadron mates would drag them from the cockpit and put someone else in. Senior Lieutenant Nadezhda Popova became one of the regiment's most decorated pilots. She flew 852 combat sorties, a record that would stand for decades. She described the physical toll. After a night of missions, your hands shook so badly you couldn't write. Your legs wouldn't hold you. Your eyes burned from staring into darkness for hours. You'd fall asleep standing up. But you'd do it again the next night because that's what we came for. The Germans quickly learned to fear the Night Witches. Soldiers reported that the sound of P-2 engines at night caused panic. Men would abandon their posts, run for bunkers, refuse to sleep. The psychological effect was enormous. A single Night Witch sortie might drop only 200 pounds of bombs, barely enough to damage a few vehicles. But the terror of nightly attacks, the inability to sleep, the constant fear, this was far more damaging than the explosives. German commanders tried everything to stop them. They offered Iron Cross medals, Germany's highest military decoration, to any pilot who shot down a Night Witch. They moved anti-aircraft batteries specifically to defend against low-altitude night attacks. They stationed night fighters at forward airfields. Nothing worked consistently. The Per-2 was too small, too slow, too unpredictable. A German pilot who finally shot down a Per-2 described his frustration. "I pursued this aircraft for 15 minutes. Every time I lined up a shot, it would turn inside my turn radius. I finally got close enough to fire, and my shells just punched holes through fabric. The aircraft kept flying. I fired again, hit the wing, and pieces of canvas flew off. Still flying. Finally I hit the engine, and it went down. When I landed and reported the kill, my commanding officer didn't believe me. He thought I was joking about shooting down a training aircraft. But the night witches were dying too. The Per-2 offered no protection. A single bullet through the fuel tank would ignite the entire aircraft. The fabric covering would burn in seconds. Pilots and navigators had no parachutes. If your aircraft caught fire, you burned to death or jumped from thousands of feet. There was no third option. The night of August 1st, 1943, was particularly brutal. The regiment lost 4 aircraft in a single night, 8 women dead. 1 crew was hit by anti-aircraft fire on approach to target. Witnesses on the ground reported the Per-2 caught fire immediately. The 2 women inside burned to death, still trying to complete their bomb run. They dropped their ordnance on target before the aircraft crashed. Another crew that night was caught by a German night fighter. The Per-2 tried to escape by diving to ground level and weaving through trees. The German pilot followed, firing continuously. He hit the Per-2's engine. The aircraft crashed into a forest. Both crew members were killed instantly. Their bodies were found days later by advancing Soviet troops. The pilot's hand was still gripping the control stick. These losses were devastating but not unusual. The regiment suffered 30% casualties over the war, higher than most male combat units. 28 crew members were killed in action. Many more were wounded, burned, or injured in crashes. Yet they kept flying. The women developed superstitions and rituals. Some refused to be photographed before missions. It was considered bad luck. Others carried specific items in their cockpits: photographs, letters, small Orthodox icons despite official atheism. One navigator carried a piece of her burned parachute from a previous crash, believing it had saved her life once and would do so again. The most famous knight, which was Nadezhda Popova, but others earned equal respect. Irina Sabrova flew over 1,000 sorties. Yekaterina Ryabova was shot down twice, crash-landed 4 times, and kept flying. Yevgenia Rudneva, the regiment's navigator, was posthumously awarded Hero of the Soviet Union after being killed in combat 3 months before war's end. The Night Witches developed innovations beyond their cutting-engine tactic. They learned to navigate using German searchlight patterns. If searchlights pointed one direction, targets of value were usually opposite. They memorized the silhouettes of German vehicles and could identify targets in brief glimpses during searchlight sweeps. They developed code words for different types of targets and would relay information between aircraft despite having no radios. By 1944, the Night Witches had become legendary throughout the Red Army. Soviet propaganda celebrated them as examples of Soviet womanhood defending the motherland. Their portrait appeared on posters, in newspapers, in propaganda films. This fame was a double-edged sword. It brought recognition but also resentment from some male units who felt overshadowed by women flying obsolete trainers. The Night Witches responded by flying more missions, taking more risks, proving themselves repeatedly. When male bomber crews refused to fly in impossible weather, fog, storms, zero visibility, the Night Witches would launch. They flew in conditions that grounded modern bombers. Their aircraft's slow speed and simple construction actually became advantages. The P-2 could fly in weather that would destroy a P-2 dive bomber or IL-2 Sturmovik. The tactical impact of the Night Witches extended beyond the bombs they dropped. German units had to maintain constant night watches, burning manpower that could have been used offensively. Anti-aircraft batteries had to defend everywhere, diluting their effectiveness. Sleep deprivation affected decision-making at all levels. German commanders described Eastern Front night operations as impossible, not due to Soviet strength, but due to the constant harassment by these ancient biplanes. One German officer's diary, captured near Kerch in 1943, described the Night Witches from the receiving end. "We all know they are women. This somehow makes it worse. Our men are terrified of them. They call them witches, night demons. When we hear their engines, all discipline breaks down. Men refuse orders, hide in bunkers, pray. I've seen soldiers with years of combat experience reduced to children by the sound of these aircraft. It's not the bombs. Those rarely hit anything important. It's the knowledge that you cannot sleep, cannot rest, cannot ever feel safe. They come every night, always in darkness, always when you finally close your eyes. This is what defeats us, not their army, but our own exhaustion." The psychological warfare was deliberate. Soviet command recognized that the Night Witches' greatest weapon was fear. They emphasized nighttime operations, kept the regiment's female composition publicized, and encouraged the witch nickname. German soldiers would be mocked by Soviet propaganda for being afraid of women in wooden airplanes. This humiliation added to the psychological impact. By late 1944, the Night Witches had evolved beyond simple harassment. They began conducting precision strikes against German supply dumps, command posts, and artillery positions. Their ability to navigate in total darkness and strike specific targets made them valuable for tactical support. Red Army ground commanders specifically requested night witch support for offensive operations. The technique for precision strikes was remarkable. The lead aircraft would locate the target using pre-mission briefing information and landmarks visible in moonlight or fires. She would mark the target by dropping a flare or simply circling above it while her wingmen attacked from different angles. German defenders would concentrate on the obvious aircraft while others struck from darkness. One mission near the Danube River in March 1945 demonstrated their capabilities. The target was a German ammunition dump hidden in a forest. The location was approximate. Soviet intelligence knew the general area, but not the exact position. The Night Witch lead aircraft spent an hour circling the forest at low altitude, looking for clues. She finally spotted camouflage netting that didn't match the surrounding trees. She marked it with a flare. 6 more P-2s struck within 5 minutes. The ammunition dump exploded, lighting up the night sky for miles. German reports later confirmed that the explosion destroyed enough ammunition to supply a division for 2 weeks. These successes came at continued cost. In April 1945, just weeks before war's end, Lieutenant Rufina Gasheva and her navigator Galina Dzunkovskaya were shot down during a mission over Germany. Gasheva survived the crash, but was captured. The Germans couldn't believe they had captured one of the famous Night Witches. She was interrogated repeatedly, with German officers asking how the tactic worked, why they weren't afraid, whether Soviet propaganda about them was true. Gasheva refused to answer anything beyond name, rank, and serial number. She was liberated 3 weeks later when Soviet forces overran her prison camp. The final statistics were extraordinary. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment flew 23,672 sorties over 3 years. They dropped 23,000 tons of bombs, destroyed or damaged over 2,000 ground targets, and never lost an aircraft to mechanical failure, only to enemy action or weather. 23 of their members were awarded Hero of the Soviet Union, the nation's highest military decoration. Many more received Orders of the Red Banner, Orders of the Red Star, and other medals. When victory came in May 1945, the Night Witches had outlasted the German forces they terrorized. They had flown their ancient biplanes from the Caucasus Mountains to Berlin. Some had been flying continuously for 3 years with barely a break. The final missions were flown over Berlin itself, dropping bombs on remaining German positions as the city fell. The reunion after the war was bittersweet. Of the approximately 400 women who served in the regiment during the war, 28 had been killed. Many more were wounded or permanently injured. Nadezhda Popova and Irina Sabrova would remain lifelong friends, meeting annually to remember fallen comrades. Yekaterina Ryabova became a flight instructor, teaching new generations of Soviet pilots. But recognition came slowly. Stalin's post-war propaganda focused on male heroes. The Night Witches were gradually written out of official histories. By the 1950s, young Soviet pilots had never heard of them. It wasn't until decades later that Russian historians rediscovered their story and gave them proper recognition. The German perspective remained consistent. Former Wehrmacht soldiers interviewed in the 1970s and 80s all remembered the Night Witches. Some admitted they had been more afraid of them than of Soviet tanks or artillery. The psychological impact had been profound and lasting. One former soldier said, "I fought at Stalingrad. I fought at Kursk. But the worst nights were when we heard those engines cutting out. You knew bombs were coming, and you couldn't do anything. You couldn't shoot back effectively, couldn't see them, couldn't sleep. It wore us down more than anything else." The P-2 aircraft itself became a symbol. After the war, the Soviet Union kept several Night Witch P-2s in museums. The aircraft looked impossibly fragile. Fabric wings, wooden frame, open cockpit. Visitors couldn't believe these ancient biplanes had terrorized the Wehrmacht. But the evidence was irrefutable. Mission logs, German reports, eyewitness accounts from both sides. Modern military analysts have studied the Night Witches extensively. Their tactics anticipated modern special operations. Small units, night operations, psychological warfare, precision strikes with minimal resources. The American military studied their methods when developing night attack helicopter tactics in the 1980s. Israeli Air Force historians have examined how they maximized effectiveness with obsolete equipment, a lesson relevant for any military facing resource constraints. The legacy of the Night Witches extends beyond military tactics. They demonstrated that gender was irrelevant in combat effectiveness. Their casualty rates, mission success rates, and combat endurance matched or exceeded male units. This was in 1942 through 45, when most world militaries didn't allow women in combat roles. The psychological impact on German forces was perhaps their greatest achievement. The Night Witches didn't win the war. Massive Soviet tank armies and artillery did that. But they contributed to victory in ways that statistics can't measure. They denied the enemy rest. They created constant fear. They forced the Germans to divert resources to defend against attacks that individually did minimal damage but collectively became unbearable. One German defensive position report from early 1945 captured this perfectly. Enemy night harassment continues. Small biplanes, believed to be female crews, attack nightly. Physical damage minimal. 1 truck destroyed, 3 wounded. But the men are exhausted. Nobody sleeps more than 2 hours per night. We have had 4 cases of soldiers refusing to leave bunkers. Morale is critical. Request immediate transfer to different sector or reinforcements to provide rotation for rest. Current situation unsustainable. Unsustainable. That was the point. The night witches made life at the front unsustainable for German forces. Not through overwhelming firepower, but through relentless pressure that never ended. The women who flew these missions were heroes in every sense. They volunteered knowing the odds. They flew aircraft that offered no protection. They took casualties that would have broken most units. They kept flying when logic said to quit. They did it for 3 years. When asked after the war why they did it, the answers were remarkably similar. Because the motherland needed us. Because we could. Because if we didn't, who would? These simple statements captured something fundamental about the Night Witches. They saw a need and filled it, regardless of danger or difficulty. The night of May 8, 1945, the Night Witches flew their final combat missions. The war in Europe was ending. Some crews cried in their cockpits, not from fear but from relief. Others were numb from exhaustion. A few felt lost. Flying had been their life for 3 years. Now what? The answer came slowly. They returned to civilian life, became teachers, doctors, engineers. Some stayed in aviation as flight instructors or test pilots. Most married, had children, lived ordinary Soviet lives. But they shared a bond that civilians couldn't understand. They had been night witches. They had flown into darkness knowing they might not return. They had heard German soldiers screaming in fear below them. They had lost friends, seen comrades burn, survived when others didn't. Every year on May 9th, Victory Day in Russia, surviving night witches would gather. The group grew smaller each year. By 2010, only a handful remained. By 2020, perhaps 1 or 2. But their story lives on. In Russia, young girls learn about them in school. Their exploits are taught at military academies. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment is remembered as one of the most effective combat units of World War II. And in Germany, even now, elderly men who served on the Eastern Front remember. They remember the sound of engines cutting out in the darkness. They remember the whistle of bombs falling from nowhere. They remember being terrified of women flying wooden biplanes. They remember losing sleep for 3 years because the night witches never stopped coming. That is the legacy. German soldiers, battle-hardened veterans of the most brutal conflict in history, reduced to fear by women in ancient aircraft who refused to quit. The mockery turned to respect, the laughter turned to terror, and the name Night Witches became synonymous with unstoppable courage. They were mocked, until the Germans learned to fear the darkness.